Hello everyone, welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is number 138 and it's titled Take a Turn, Leave a Turn. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is completely random, and it was Magosi the Waterveil. So Magosi the Waterveil is a land, and we don't normally do lands here, so it's kind of interesting to see. But it's a land that enters the battlefield tapped, taps to add a blue to your mana pool. You can pay a blue and tap it to put an Eon counter on Magosi the Waterveil and skip your next turn. Then you can also tap it to remove an Eon counter from Magosi the Waterveil and return it to its owner's hand. Take an extra turn after this one. So this is a really weird card, and honestly, because it's such a weird card, the deck tech this week is also going to look a little bit weird. We've kind of followed the same general theme and the same general plan for almost every single deck tech that I've done for this channel. This one's actually going to be a little bit different. But one thing that will still stay the same is the fact that we do got to talk about our commander, and this is where you might be a little bit surprised to see the fact that we have Atraxa Grand Unifier in the command zone, which is a massive $11.73. So Atraxa is taking up a decent portion of our budget right here, but I really wanted to play at least 4 colors, and I didn't feel like dipping into 5 for red because I didn't really think the deck needed it. Plus, Atraxa is great for card draw, so we have a bit of a power boost in the command zone this week, which is not something we're used to. But in case you don't know, Atraxa is 3 green, white, blue, black for a 7/7 legendary creature, Phyrexian Angel. She has flying, vigilance, death touch, and lifelink. And when Atraxa Grand Unifier enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand and put the rest on the bottom in a random order. So Atraxa is really mainly just here for the colors and the card draw. I've definitely seen some Atraxa decks try to blink her and kind of do some shenanigans with that. That is not what we're here for. What we are here for, though, is comboing. And that's a weird thing to say considering we're built around Atraxa and a land, but normally, this is where I would talk about the themes of the deck and the key cards in the deck. But since we're here to combo, it really only makes sense that we talk about the combos. And yes, that is combos plural. There are actually 3 different infinite combos in this entire deck, and that is what we are built around. And the first one, which obviously is going to be using our card of the week because this is what we're entirely built around, is a 4-card combo. We're going to start with the most complicated one, but the one that the deck is actually built around. So we have Magosi, which we've already talked about. The only other card in the entirety of Magic the Gathering that uses Eon counters, just like Magosi, is Out of the Tombs. So Out of the Tombs is 2 and a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 Eon counters on Out of the Tombs, then mill cards equal to the number of Eon counters on it. If you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, instead return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you can't, you lose the game. So that leaves us with a bit of a weird situation. If we can take the Eon counters from Out of the Tombs and put them onto Magosi, we never actually have to skip our turn to activate it. Meaning that if we can find a way to have Magosi come into play with an Eon counter, and also untapped, we could take infinite turns. And the 2 things that are going to let us do that are Goldberry River Daughter, and in this case, Voyaging Satyr, but you could also put any other land untapped card here. I just put the Satyr because I kind of like the art. So, Goldberry is 1 and a blue for a 1/3 legendary creature nymph. You can tap her to move a counter of each kind not on Goldberry River Daughter from another target permanent you control onto Goldberry. Then you can pay a blue and tap her, move 1 or more counters from Goldberry onto another target permanent you control. If you do, draw a card. Then, of course, Voyaging Satyr, 1 and a green, 1/2 Satyr Druid, tap, untap, target land. So this is, like I said, very convoluted, very complicated. But essentially, what we want to do is have a non-summoning sick Goldberry in play, along with an Out of the Tombs that we also untapped with, so we do need to untap with both of these cards, So that way Out of the Tombs has at least one Eon counter on it. Then we can play Magosi. It's going to come in tapped, which is a shame. So we will need, once again, a non-summoning sick Voyaging Satyr to then untap Magosi. We can tap Goldberry to get the Out of the Tombs Eon counters onto her, and then, another turn goes by. And then we can use Goldberry to then move the counters onto Magosi. And it specifically says move one or more counters from Goldberry onto it. So if we can be taking infinite turns, we can kind of rack up all of these counters onto Goldberry and then start putting them on Magosi and then kind of shift it off every single turn. And we do have cards in the deck that untap more than just target land. They do untap target permanent. We have some things that untap 2 target permanents. One of our big key pieces for this actually is a Planeswalker. Kiora can untap both a creature and a land, which makes her the perfect card for this. But the idea is that as long as Magosi can come into play either untapped or we can untap it, we can then put an Eon counter on it, tap it, and then immediately take an extra turn. And so as long as Magosi is our land drop every single turn, we can make sure that we are always putting Eon counters on it to eventually win the game because we're taking an infinite amount of extra turns. So, like I said, very complicated. I appreciate you bearing with me through that, but I wanted to try to find some way to turn Magosi's drawback into, well, not a drawback. So that is combo number 1. And when I was building this deck, I realized if we're going all in on this combo, what do we do if someone exiles Goldberry or someone exiles Out of the Tombs or even just Magosi? We're kind of out of luck. We don't really have another big game plan other than beating people down with Atraxa. So that's when I figured we may as well throw in a couple more combos. And since we're so heavily focused on Magosi and Voyaging Satyr type effects, this is a very landfall heavy deck, so I wanted to try a second combo, which this one is slightly landfall focused, but it's also one less card. So if you don't want to go the full 4-card combo with Magosi, we have a backup with Smeagol, Helpful Guide, Dunedain Rangers, and in this case Zendikar's Royal, but it could be any enchantment or creature that makes creatures when we play a land. So the way that this one works is we have Smeagol, Helpful Guide. So at the beginning of your end step, if a creature died under your control this turn, the ring tempts you. Whenever the ring tempts you, target opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card. Put that card onto the battlefield tapped under your control and the rest into their graveyard. So as long as we can be tempted by the ring, we can keep stealing our opponent's lands. That works out perfectly with Dunedain Rangers, which is 3 and a green. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, if you don't control a ring bearer, the ring tempts you. So we get tempted by the ring with the Dunedain Rangers. We don't search an opponent's deck. They reveal cards from the top of their deck till they hit a land. We get it. That triggers landfall. We get tempted again as long as we don't have a ring bearer. And that's the tricky part of this. So because of the way that we're focused on Out of the Tombs and Magosi, we naturally have a bunch of sacrifice outlets in the deck. So with a sacrifice outlet, we can play the land, trigger Zendikar's Royal, which is 3 green for an enchantment with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 2/2 green elemental creature token. That token comes into play, trigger Dunedain Rangers, we make that token one of our ring bearers, and now if we can sacrifice the token before we make another land drop, we can actually trigger Smeagol an infinite number of times, provided our opponents have an infinite number of lands in their deck, which they don't. So eventually we will mill our opponents out. And typically, this isn't going to immediately kill the entire table. That is very worth noting here. It will take out one player, but it will leave the other 2 unless you have a way to make another land drop and restart the process. So I would highly recommend probably just hitting each player one at a time, getting their libraries as low as possible, and then starting to pick them off if you can. So that is combo number 2. Definitely still complicated, but not nearly as complicated as the first one. And then we get into combo number 3. This is the last one that was put into the deck, and it was the last one that I really thought about, and it's actually only a 2-card combo. I figured we were taking a bunch of extra turns. That was our goal here. We wanted to take as many extra turns as possible, And we actually had a lot of our budget left over to work with. So I figured, since we're taking extra turns, why not just, not take the extra turns? And to do that, we just need 2 cards, and that is Teferi's Protection and Lethal Vapors. So Teferi's Protection is 2 and a white for an instant. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you have protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out. Exile Teferi's Protection. That, combined with Lethal Vapors, which is 2 black for an enchantment, whenever a creature comes into play, destroy it. 0, destroy Lethal Vapors. You skip your next turn. Any player may play this ability. What we can actually do here is activate Lethal Vapors essentially an infinite number of times, because it's going to put those triggers on the stack. So we can skip an infinite amount of turns, and then once we've done that, we can cast Teferi's Protection, and until our next turn, our life total can't change, and we have protection from everything. What that essentially means is we are never going to lose life. We are never going to take damage. Nothing is going to happen to us because we're never going to get another turn. So what's going to happen is our opponents are going to draw their cards and eventually run out of cards to play, and provided they don't have a way to shuffle cards back in, then eventually we just win because they're going to mill themselves out. Now, this isn't to say they can't have a card that straight up says you win the game on it, and that does still prevent this from happening. Well, I guess it doesn't prevent it from happening, but it prevents us from comboing in the way that we would like to combo. So that is something to be aware of. This is not a foolproof plan by any means, but like I said, we had the extra budget and we were kind of already going pretty hard in on a couple of combos, so I figured, what's one more? So that is the last combo of the deck. There's obviously other cards that synergize with a lot of what we're doing. We have a lot of landfall synergies and things like that, but these are the only 3 major combos in the deck. So because this deck tech looks a little different than normal, we are going to jump straight into the price of this one, because I don't think there's much point in talking about key cards, because we've kind of mentioned all of that, and there's no point in talking about our themes because we've kind of mentioned all of that. And then also with our cool interactions, they all really just kind of play into the 3 combos. We've got some tutor effects, but nothing I felt was worth mentioning because it just kind of felt like we were going to repeat ourselves. So with that in mind, the actual deck price is still not quite as high as you would expect, considering we have a $26 card and an $11 card in here. It's only $89.69, with the most expensive card obviously being Teferi's Protection, the second being Atraxa, and then the third actually being Lethal Vapors. So if you were to remove these 3 cards, you trim the price of the deck down by almost $40. So you can cut the price of this deck almost in half just by removing one of our 3 combos and swapping out the commander for a different commander, which is pretty impressive overall, considering that's, like I said, half of our budget right there. But if you wanted to see the most expensive card that's not one of these 3, that would actually wind up being the Altar of Dementia. So out of the tombs, like we mentioned earlier, needs us to have creatures in our graveyard, otherwise we lose the game, which is not ideal. So Altar of Dementia gives us a free sacrifice outlet, so we can just keep sacrificing cards to put creatures back into our graveyard so we never lose the game. But it actually also works as a secondary win condition, because if we're taking infinite turns, that's not enough to actually just win the game. We do need to actually win the game. And Altar of Dementia gives us a chance to infinitely mill out our opponents on each of our infinite turns. So it is a win condition in the deck. It's not necessary by any means. We actually have plenty of win conditions in the deck, but it synergizes well enough that I do think it earns the spot here. And obviously, if you were going to trim price, this is not the card to cut. The cards to cut would be Teferi's Protection, Atraxa, and then Lethal Vapors. So that is something to consider. But if you're actually looking for an increase to the price of this deck, I do have a suggestion for you there, a card that I couldn't quite squeeze in, and that card was Grand Abolisher. So I mentioned earlier with Teferi's Protection and Lethal Vapors that you could skip your turns. Your opponents could do it too. There's going to be very small chance that they actually do, but it is possible. So if you want to prevent that entirely, you play Grand Abolisher, because it is white for a 2/2 human cleric. During your turn, your opponents can't cast spells or activate abilities of artifacts, creatures, or enchantments. And so what this really wants us to do is combo off, right? If we're comboing on our turn, the biggest threat to what we're doing is going to be interaction, especially if we're taking an infinite number of turns with Magosi. We need to make sure that our opponents can't interact with what we're doing, and Grand Abolisher makes sure that nobody can. We are going to be able to have complete control over our turns, and nobody's going to be able to stop us. With that in mind, if you had to take a card out for Grand Abolisher, I would recommend Kelpie Guide, which is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 beast. You can tap it to untap another target permanent you control, and tap it to tap target permanent, but activate only if you control 8 or more lands. This is a card that, while very good, and it does untap a permanent, which is very worth mentioning, we have so many of these types of cards in the deck that it doesn't do quite enough to really warrant just being another untap effect, and the bonus of being able to tap a permanent is going to be very unlikely to be used, especially because if we have 8 or more lands, we're not really worried about just tapping one thing down. We're probably more worried about comboing. So if you had to make a cut for something, I do suggest taking Kelpie Guide out and putting in Grand Abolisher. But of course, if you can't afford the extra $7, I completely understand. Kelpie Guide is still very good, just not quite as good considering there's a bunch of other untappers. But that is our deck tech this week. So before we get into the actual game, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. All of our social media accounts are up here on screen, so if you're interested, you can find us on Twitter, Reddit, send us an email. And if you're looking to support the content a little bit more directly, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out so much, and we are trying to push to 1,000 subscribers before the end of the year. I think we can make it, but it might take a little bit of work. So if you know anyone who might enjoy the videos, please do send them their way. But if you're looking for a more direct way to help support the channel, you can find us on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. So a quick shout out to all of our patrons and channel members. We have William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, and Patty Whack. To all of you, thank you so much. And if you would like your name listed among these amazing people, like I said, check out our Patreon or here on YouTube as a channel member. And that is the only way to guarantee that any suggestions you have for future videos get turned into videos. I will, of course, do my best to get to any of them that are suggested in the comments and things like that. But if you want my guarantee, it's got to be one of those two ways. Sometimes I get a little bit too backed up with all the decks, so that's where you got to go. But with all of that being said, I think that's enough rambling. Let's get into our game. So this week, we are joined by 3 opponents, of course, and we are being joined by Doodle, playing Wyleth, Soul of Steel, Bilal, playing Magus, Lucia Kane, and Cole, playing Davros, Dalek, Creator. So starting off with Wyleth, Soul of Steel, and Doodle's build of it, this is typically when you see Wyleth in an equipment deck, but Doodle's build is an aura deck, so he's specifically focusing on auras and enchantments, and he still wants to get Wyleth as big as possible and just swing in, do a ton of damage, draw a bunch of cards. So I think out of all of our opponents, this is probably the one that I'm most concerned about, because we don't have a great way to stop a massive trampling beater. Yeah, we have Atraxa, but if he gets to be like a 20/20 with trample, even Atraxa can't stop him. So I think Wyleth is my number 1 pick for the scariest opponent at the table. Next up, though, we have Bilal and Magus Lucia Kane, and this is an X spell deck. He's focused pretty heavily on the Tyranids that actually came into the precon. So there's a lot of +1/+1 counters. There's a lot of burn effects. This is the kind of deck that can kind of win out of nowhere if you're not paying enough attention to it. The fact that Magus Lucia Kane can activate and just make 2 mana, which then doubles a spell, can be absolutely devastating. So I do think that this is a deck to be concerned about, but I'm hoping that with Atraxa's life gain and with some of our combo synergies, we can probably go off a little bit quicker than Bilal can. And then last but not least, we have Cole playing Davros. I honestly have no idea what to expect from the Davros deck, but I am very much looking forward to it. I think the idea of having the 3/3 Dalek creature tokens is super cool, and then being able to give your opponents that villainous choice of either drawing a card or them discarding a card seems very strong. So I think that overall this deck is going to play very differently than a lot of Grixis decks because it's focused pretty heavily on the tokens, and Yeah, there's still some artifacts, which is a very Grixis thing, but I think overall it's going to be very cool to see. So I am very excited for that. I hope you all are excited for this game. I know I certainly am. So let's see how our deck performs. Let me know down in the comments if there's any of these decks you think would be the hardest for our deck to take on. Let me know if there's any suggestions you have for future upgrades to this deck, cards you think might not be worth it, or just suggestions for future videos. So with all that being said, let's jump into the game and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by myself, Bilal, and then Cole. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. I play a Command Tower and cast Carrion Feeder, letting me sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Bilal plays a Mountain. Cole plays a Fetid Pools. Doodle plays a Plains. I play an Island and cast Druid Class, letting me gain a life whenever I play a land. Then I move to combat and attack Doodle for 1. Bilal plays an Exotic Orchard. Cole plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Doodle plays an Arid Mesa, sacrificing it and losing a life to search his library for a Sacred Foundry, paying 2 life to put it into play untapped. Then he casts his commander Wyleth, Soul of Steel, but Bilal responds, countering it with Arcane Denial, drawing a card in the next upkeep while Doodle gets to draw 2. I play an Exotic Orchard, gaining a life. Then I level up Druid Class, letting me play an additional land on each of my turns. This allows me to play a Plains and gain another life. Bilal plays a Rootbound Crag and casts Adelan Jackal, immediately attacking me for 2 since it has haste, then, when it deals combat damage to a player, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Cole plays a Drowned Catacombs and casts Read the Bones, scrying 2, drawing 2 cards, and losing 2 life. Doodle plays a Plains. I play a Swamp, gaining a life. Then I cast Cultivate, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting 1 into play tapped, gaining a life, and putting the other into my hand. Then I play the Forest I just put to my hand, gaining yet another life. Then I cast Invasion of Amonkhet, having Cole defend it and then also making each player mill 3, each opponent discard a card, and I draw a card. I then move to combat, attacking the invasion for 1. Bilal plays a Mountain and cast Orin Frostfang, letting him draw a card whenever one of his creatures deals combat damage to a player. He attacks me for 2 with the Jackal, but before the damage, Doodle casts Path to Exile, exiling the Oran Frostfang, so Bilal doesn't get to draw a card, but he does still get to search his library for 2 basic lands, 1 for the Jackal and 1 for the Path, putting them both into play tapped. Cole plays a Frostboil Snarl, revealing an island so it comes into play untapped, then casts Solemn Simulacrum, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Doodle plays a Mountain and recasts his commander Wyleth, this time resolving and letting Doodle draw a card for each aura and equipment attached to him when he attacks. On my turn, I cast my commander Atraxa Grand Unifier, revealing the top 10 cards of my library and putting 1 of each card type into my hand and the rest on the bottom of my deck. This winds up drawing me Invasion of Zendikar, Kelpie Guide, Swamp, and Behold the Beyond. I play the Swamp, gaining a life, and cast Viscera Seer, letting me sacrifice a creature to scry 1. Then I play an Arcane Sanctum, gaining another life, and move to combat, attacking Bilal for 1. On Bilal's turn, he cast Altered Ego for X = 3, entering as a copy of Atraxa Grand Unifier, but with 3 +1/+1 counters. This lets Bilal reveal the top 10 cards of his library and put an Island, the Great Henge, Open the Way, and Exocrine into his hand. He then plays an Island and attacks Doodle for 2 with the Jackal, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped when it deals combat damage. Cole plays a Drowned Catacombs and casts Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, then also cast Determined Iteration, letting him populate when he moves to combat, giving the created token haste, and then sacrificing it at the beginning of the next end step. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Squeeze Embrace, enchanting Wyleth, giving him +2/+2 and returning him to Doodle's hand when he dies. Then he also casts Battle Mastery, enchanting Wyleth, giving him Double Strike. He moves to combat, attacking Cole for 8 damage with Wyleth, drawing 2 cards. Cole blocks with Solemn Simulacrum, only taking 6 thanks to Trample, then drawing a card when the construct dies. On my turn, I cast Invasion of Zendikar, choosing Doodle to defend it, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped, and gaining 2 life. I then cast Kiora, Master of the Depths, activating her -2 ability, revealing the top 4 cards of my library, putting a creature and land from among them into my hand, which end up being Tatyova Benthic Druid and an island. I play the island, gaining a life. Then I also cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for another basic land, putting it into play tapped, and gaining another life. I move to combat, attacking the Invasion of Zendikar with Atraxa, gaining 7 life thanks to lifelink, and transforming the battle into Awakened Skyclave, which gains me yet another life since it's also a land. Bilal cast the Great Henge, letting any of his creatures enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter, letting him draw a card when a creature enters the battlefield under his control, and also tapping for 2 green mana while gaining him 2 life. He then casts his commander, Magus Lucia Kane, entering with a +1/+1 counter, drawing Bilal a card, letting him put a +1/+1 counter on a creature he controls when he moves to combat, and letting her tap for 2 colorless mana, which, when spent on a spell or ability with X in its cost, copies that spell. He then casts Swiftfoot Boots, immediately equipping them to his commander, giving her haste and hexproof. Then he's able to use Kane and the Great Henge to cast Open the Way for X=2, gaining 2 life and copying it so he reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals 4 total lands, putting them into play under his control. He attacks Cole for 10 with Atraxa, gaining 10 life, and attacks Doodle for 3 with the Jackal since he put a counter on it with his commander at the start of combat, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Cole plays an island and casts Over the Top, making each player reveal a number of cards from the top of their library equal to the number of non-land permanents they control, putting all permanents revealed this way onto the battlefield and the rest into their graveyards. This ends with Cole getting an Exotic Orchard, Doodle getting a Mountain, Bilal getting Edric's Spymaster of Trest, letting any player draw a card when their creatures do combat damage to a player who's not Bilal, Game Trail, and 2 forests. Then I get a Swamp, 2 islands, gaining 3 life, Archelos, Lagoon Mystic, letting each other player and permanent enter untapped as long as he's untapped, and a Kaya Intangible Slayer. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Sky Blade's Boon, enchanting Wyleth to give him +1/+1 and flying. He also casts Sage's Reverie, giving Wyleth +1/+1 for each aura Doodle controls that's attached to a creature, and also drawing him a card for each of his other auras as well, drawing 4 cards. He then casts Darksteel Mutation, enchanting Bilal's copy of Atraxa, turning it into a 0/1 insect with indestructible and no other abilities. He attacks Bilal for 18 with Wyleth, drawing 4 cards. On my turn, I cast Behold the Beyond, discarding my hand and searching my library for 3 cards, putting them into my hand. Once that resolves, I cast Retreat to Emeria, letting me make a 1/1 core ally creature token, or give my creatures +1/+1 until the end of turn whenever I play a land. I also cast Smeagol, Helpful Guide, which has me getting tempted by the ring in my end step if a creature died under my control this turn, and also makes target opponent mill cards from the top of their library until they mill a land, putting into play under my control whenever I'm tempted by the ring. I activate Kiora's +1 ability, untapping my Awakened Skyclave on an island, with the goal of winning the game by casting my 3rd combo piece, but unfortunately, Doodle has an answer, casting Deflecting Swap for free since he controls his commander, redirecting the ability to instead untap Wyleth and Bilal's island. Still hoping to find a land drop, I activate Kaya's 0 ability to draw 2 cards, letting each opponent scry 1, unfortunately not finding the land. I do find a Voyaging Satyr to cast though, which can tap to untap target land. I attack the Invasion of Amonkhet with Atraxa, gaining 7 life and transforming the battle into Lazotep Convert, which enters the battlefield as a 4/4 copy of Tatyova Benthic Druid in my graveyard, allowing me to draw a card and gain a life whenever a land enters under my control. I then sacrifice Carrion Feeder to Viscera Seer, scrying 1, Then when I moved my end step, since a creature died under my control, the ring tempts me, making the convert my ring bearer, and Bilal mills until he hits a command tower, which comes into play under my control, making me a core ally token, gaining me 2 life, and drawing me a card. Bilal moves straight to combat, putting a +1/+1 counter on Edric, and attacks Cole for 9, drawing 3 cards, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into play. Then he plays a Rimewood Falls and casts Eternal Witness, returning Zoanthrope from his graveyard to his hand when it enters play, putting a counter on it and drawing a card. He casts Zoanthrope for X=16 using Magosi Out, so it's doubled. Both copies enter the battlefield, doing 16 damage each to me, then the original gets a +1/+1 counter and Bilal draws a card. Cole casts a Commander Sphere, immediately tapping it for mana and sacrificing it to draw a card. Doodle plays a Reliquary Tower, gaining no maximum hand size, then casts Slash the Ranks, destroying all non-commander creatures and planeswalkers. In response, I sacrifice all my creatures to scry 1 a total of 7 times, then the board wipe resolves. After that, he casts Esper Sentinel, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, unless they pay mana equal to the Sentinel's power. Doodle then attacks me for 18 with Wylith, drawing 4 cards on attacks, and I block with Atraxa, only taking 11, but killing my commander. On my turn, I cast Dryad's Revival, returning Emergent Ultimatum from my graveyard to my hand, paying for Esper Sentinel. Then I cast the Emergent Ultimatum, but unfortunately Doodle still has an answer, countering it with Tybalt's Trickery. This mills the top card of my library, then I reveal cards until I hit a non-land card, casting it for free, which winds up being Teferi's Protection. I don't get to resolve that either though, as Bilal counters it with a negate, not paying for Esper Sentinel, so Doodle draws a card. Once all that's resolved, I cast Dunedain Ranger, letting me get tempted by the ring whenever a land enters under my control. On Bilal's turn, he casts Exocrine with Magosi Out for X=18. This makes him 2 copies of it, which both enter the battlefield and do 18 damage to each creature and player, hitting everyone for 36 total damage, leaving Bilal at 1 life while knocking everyone else out, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. There was so much happening in that game. It was honestly very tough to keep an eye on everything. But overall, a very, very cool showing by pretty much every deck at the table. Unfortunately, Cole didn't quite get to do everything he wanted to do. We didn't even see any Daleks, which is very sad. But hopefully this deck will make a comeback and we can see it again in the future and kind of get some of those things rolling. Doodle's deck also did very well. He struggled a bit early on with the removal of Wylith, but once he was able to stick Wylith on the board and suit him up with enchantments, Wylith became a massive threat that could have just taken anybody out of the game pretty much at any time. So that was very cool to see. Bilal's deck also very impressive. The fact that he, as bad as it sounds, didn't do too much for most of the game, being able to ramp every single turn with the Adelan Jackal and then just dump a massive amount of mana into an Exocrine to do a massive 36 damage when he was at 37 life was very, very impressive. So very cool showing by that. And then of course our deck did very well. A little unfortunate, there was a point when I was trying to combo off with Smeagol and the Dunedain Rangers, and I actually had the ability to exile Doodle's commander, Wylith, before trying to set up the combo, and if I had, he wouldn't have been able to use the deflecting swat, so a little bit of a punt on my end. I do think I could have won if I'd played that a little bit differently, but not quite the game this time, so maybe next time. But let me know overall what you think. Let me know, like I said earlier, if there's any cards you think that should be included, cards you think aren't quite worth it in the deck, and let me know if there's anything that you would like to see in the future. So thank you all so much for watching. If you did like it, please do actually like the video and subscribe to the channel. Like I said, I'm trying to hit 1,000 by the end of the year. Who knows if we'll get there, but that is the goal. So thank you all so much again, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.